Well, my topic for today is not specifically about American independence, but it does very much have to do with history. I'd like to begin with a quote. It's a bit lengthy, but I think it's very helpful to read through the entirety of it to begin the message. It begins, "Every generation rewrites the past. In easy times, history is more or less of an ornamental art, but in times of danger, we are driven to the written record by a pressing need to find answers to the riddles of today. We need to know what kind of firm ground other men, belonging to generations before us, have found to stand on. In spite of changing conditions of life, they were not very different from ourselves. Their thoughts were the grandfathers of our thoughts. They managed to meet situations as difficult as those we have to face, to meet them sometimes lightheartedly, and, in some measure, to make their hopes prevail. We need to know how they did it. In times of change and danger, when there is a quicksand of fear under men's reasoning, a sense of continuity with generations gone before can stretch like a lifeline across the scary present and get us past the delusion of the exceptional now that blocks good thinking. That is why, in times like ours, when old institutions are caving in and being replaced by new institutions, not necessarily in accord with most men's preconceived hopes, political thought has to look backwards as well as forwards." I found this very helpful when I came across it. These words of concern or warning could really be from any point in human history. These words were written by John dos Passos in 1941, and they are the preface for the book titled Land of Hope, An Invitation to the Great American Story, copyright 2019. Found it very helpful, very poignant. It's really a more eloquent and detailed explanation of the common phrase, "Those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it." John dos Passos was an American novelist. He traveled extensively in Europe after he graduated from Harvard in 1916. During World War I, he was an ambulance driver for the American Volunteer Motor Ambulance Corps in Paris and then in Italy, before he officially joined the United States Army Medical Corps as a private. This is in World War I. Knowing of his firsthand frontline exposure and experience during World War I, we can see why he would have written these words 20 to 25 years later in 1941. 1941 was during World War II. By this time, it was far more than a small skirmish in Europe that many viewed it as early on. It was in December of 1941 when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and the U.S. officially joined the war. John dos Passos would have seen the horror of war during World War I, the deadliest war to that point, an estimated 40 million casualties, and then that was surpassed, of course, by World War II with an estimated 70 million casualties. I'd like to repeat just a few excerpts from the quote I read just a moment ago from John dos Passos. He says, "Every generation rewrites the past." And then later he says, "We need to know what kind of firm ground other men, belonging to generations before us, have found to stand on. In spite of changing conditions of life, they were not very different from ourselves. Their thoughts were the grandfathers of our thoughts. They managed to meet situations as difficult as those we have to face." Really appreciate how he wrote this, the grandfathers of our thoughts. When these words were written, the world was in an upheaval. They were written with passion and with concern. When we go through trials, when we go through difficulties, we too respond with a greater passion and a greater concern than normal, than we typically do. We think deeply about life. We think about its meaning and about its purpose. We think about right and wrong. We think about how to improve our own lives. Now, there is much war and unrest in the world today, and it's growing worse, but we are not in the midst of an all-out world war like they experienced in the 1940s. Does that mean that these words don't apply to us as much as it did to them? Well, of course not. These words do apply to us. The principle they communicate is useful for our lives. We face challenges every day. What we believe and the life that we've committed to, that is God's way of life, we've committed to living His way of life, is constantly under attack. We are under attack. And God will help us. He will protect us. He will strengthen us. He promises. We heard about some of that in the sermonette. Well done, encouraging us to not forget His benefits. He will help us, but we must do our part as well. And that's what I'd like to focus on in this message. One way that we can do our part is to observe and learn from men and women belonging to generations before us. There are many lessons we can learn from them, and in this sermon, I'd like to review 4 lessons we can learn from examples recorded for us in God's Word, examples of His servants who went before us. The title for today is Learning from Those Who Went Before Us. Learning from those who went before us. For lesson number 1, I'd like to turn to Acts chapter 8. Acts chapter 8, and we'll begin reading in verse 26. I'd like to look at the example of a man that we do not know his name, but we are told that he was an important man, held high position, powerful, intelligent, he was wealthy. Powerful men in the world who hold these high positions of authority and influence tend to be arrogant, tend to be know-it-alls. And this man was different. Let's begin reading Acts chapter 8 and verse 26. It says here, "Now an angel of the Lord spoke to Philip, saying, 'Arise and go toward the south, along the road which goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is desert.'" I'll just pause there just briefly for some background. This was a well-known highway. When we look up the history of it, well-known highway that goes from Jerusalem down to Gaza, about 50 miles, and then it joined an even bigger highway to Egypt, just south of Gaza. William Barclay says that the traffic of half the world went by this road, and that Gaza was the last settlement before the road went through mostly desert on the way to Egypt. So a well-known highway that Philip would have been very familiar with. Verse 27 and 28, "So he arose," speaking of Philip, "he arose and went, and behold, a man of Ethiopia, a eunuch of great authority under Candace the queen of the Ethiopians, who had charge of all her treasury and had come to Jerusalem to worship, was returning, and sitting in his chariot, he was reading Isaiah the prophet." We'll pause there. Here's where we're introduced to the man. And I'd like to take time to note several things to give us a picture of who this man was, this Ethiopian man. It says that he was a eunuch. Now, this doesn't always mean that he would have literally been a eunuch. Oftentimes, it says that this can refer to just anyone serving a monarch. It could be a military leader, it could be a government official, which was the case here. And it says that he came to worship in Jerusalem, which means he was a proselyte, someone who converted to Judaism. And another point as to why he would not have been a literal eunuch is because he would have not been allowed to convert and partake and be part of the synagogue in the Jewish community if that were the case. And they certainly would not have sold him a scroll of Isaiah the prophet unless he was truly a proselyte, fully converted in that way. Next point, it says that he's from Ethiopia. Today, Ethiopia isn't thought of as a mighty and powerful nation, but at this time, it very much was. Even Egypt, in its height, did not conquer it, could not subjugate it. And they were able to defend against Ethiopia, but they weren't strong enough to conquer it. Next, who is Candace? The commentaries say that it's not actually a proper name, but a title. David Johnson says that it was more likely this was pronounced Kandake instead of Candace, Kandake, and it was a similar title as that of Pharaoh, the female counterpart, so to speak, of the title Pharaoh. Next point, it says that he held a high position. He held a high position. He was over all the finances of Ethiopia, a very powerful nation at the time. And this helps explain how he could afford a personal copy of the scroll of Isaiah, as well as be educated enough to read it in Hebrew. And the last thing I'd like to note from these two verses is that he was convicted enough, this man of Ethiopia was convicted enough in his beliefs, in his religion, to make a very long and difficult journey all the way from Ethiopia to Jerusalem. Now, Ethiopia was south of Egypt and approximately 1,500 miles south of Jerusalem. Now, that would be similar to us driving from here, a horse and buggy, all the way down to Corpus Christi, Texas. That's at the very southern tip of Texas. Google Maps says it's a 22-hour drive by car from here. My math, we'll see if I don't know how accurate it is, but my math says that by horse and buggy, it would be approximately 130 hours each way, which, if you were driving 24/7 without any stops, would be 6 days straight. So I'm guessing this was about a 2-week journey to Jerusalem and 2-week journey back. So he was very committed and convicted to go to Jerusalem, and this wasn't the first time. It's something he did regularly to worship. Let's continue reading verses 29 through 31. Acts 8, verse 29, it says, "Then the Spirit said to Philip, 'Go near and overtake this chariot.' So Philip ran to him and heard him reading the prophet Isaiah and said, 'Do you understand what you are reading?' And he said, 'How can I unless someone guides me?' And he asked Philip to come up and sit with him." This really is hard for us to imagine, really. It's not how things are done now. One, he was reading out loud. We don't really do this anymore. Back then, most people were not able to read, so it was common for someone who could to read out loud so those around them could hear what they were reading from the scriptures. And two, a stranger, in this case Philip, comes running alongside of your car, your chariot, your carriage, and starts talking to you. He didn't, in his high and mighty position, say, "Shoo, get away, you strange man." No, he listened. He wanted to learn. He said, "How can I learn except someone guides me?" He was not too proud to ask for help. So point number one we learn from this Ethiopian man is seek to understand. Lesson number one is seek to understand. If we are to learn from those who go before us, then we must be willing to learn. We must seek out understanding. This Ethiopian man was, again, said multiple times, he was in a powerful position. Most often, he would have been doing the teaching. He would have been doing the directing, giving orders. But he was not only willing to admit that he didn't fully understand what he was reading, he asked to be taught. He had a desire to understand. He wasn't proud or stubborn. He was teachable. Let's continue reading verse 32 through 35. It says, "The place in the scripture which he read was this: He was led as a sheep to the slaughter, and as a lamb before its shearer is silent, so he opened not his mouth. In his humiliation his justice was taken away, and who will declare his generation? For his life is taken from the earth." So the eunuch answered Philip and said, "I ask of you, of whom does the prophet say this? Of himself or of some other man?" Then Philip opened his mouth and began at this scripture, preached Jesus to him. This man was teachable. He asked questions. He asked here, who is this talking about? Of the prophet or of some other man? Something interesting to note is that to this day, the Jews do not understand the suffering servant passage, as this is referred to from Isaiah 53. To this day, they do not understand it. Unlike the Ethiopian man here, the Jews were not teachable. They were not teachable. Jesus Christ taught them. The Son of God taught them. Especially the religious leaders were closed off to his teachings. They were not willing to believe what he told them. This man was different. We'll finish off the story of the Ethiopian reading verses 36 to 37. "Now as they went down the road, they came to some water." So Philip had been preaching to him more of the scriptures. They came to some water, and the eunuch said, "See, here is water. What hinders me from being baptized?" Then Philip said, "If you believe with all your heart, you may." And he answered and said, "I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God." The takeaway: this important high-ranking official proves his humility, his teachable attitude, and his faith in God by his words and by responding to what he was taught with action. He asked to be baptized and fully commit to serving God. He had converted to Judaism, now he's converting to Christianity. We all have had stubborn, proud, and closed-minded attitudes at different times in our lives. If we look back, sometimes we're not very open-minded. We're not teachable. Something we probably still struggle with occasionally. But we are also teachable, or we would not be here in God's church on the Sabbath, being taught, being open to what God allows us to understand. How can we show a teachable attitude like this man of Ethiopia? How can we seek to understand? A few suggestions. We must ask questions. We must have an open mind. We must be willing to admit that our ideas may not be right. And we must search for resources that provide the answers to our questions. We can learn from this Ethiopian man, of whose name we do not know, that we should seek to understand. Seek to understand. Lesson number 2. Let's turn to Genesis chapter 12. For the second lesson, Genesis chapter 12. A little background we can read in chapter 11. It says that Abram first moved and went from Ur of the Chaldeans to Haran with his father. Now, Ur was in modern-day southeastern Iraq near the Persian Gulf, and Haran was northwest from there at the far northern border of modern-day Syria, about 700 miles away. Let's read. So he had already moved once. Let's read in Genesis 12, verse 1 through 3. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Now the Lord had said to Abram, "Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And pause there. God tells Abram, leave, move again. He'd already moved a long distance once. Leave everything you know and travel to a place I will show you. Emphasis on I will show you. He did not tell him where he was going. He promised him blessings. He promised him protection. But he did not tell him a location. God said, go. I'll show you. Trust me. Let's read verse 4. So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Now, we don't know all of the dialogue. We just know what, God inspired to record here. How did God communicate with Abram? We don't really know. It says that God spoke to him. Was it through messengers, similar to how later 3 men came to him and told him that Sarah would bear him a son? Was it like that? We don't know. Did Abram ask questions and initially make excuses like Moses did? We don't know for sure, but what God inspired to be recorded doesn't indicate any hesitation. Abram didn't hesitate or doubt. He didn't say, God, I was really looking forward to retiring here. I'm 75 years old. I'm tired. I'm pretty settled. I'm comfortable here. I don't want to move. He didn't say that. It says that he obeyed. So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him. Lesson number 2, prompt obedience even when we don't understand. We can learn from those who went before us. Prompt obedience even when we don't understand. The next few verses talk about how that they traveled south to Canaan. It doesn't mean that Abram knew that's where they were going. Of course, these words were recorded after the events, but in general, people like to know where they're going. I know I do. I don't like to know be told to do something and being given no direction, no instruction. I'm just going, have no idea what to expect. That's human nature. But Abram didn't doubt. I'm sure it was a challenge for him. I'm sure it tested his faith just like it would us. But he did it. He obeyed. Let's pick it up in verse 7. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your descendants I will give this land, and there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. God appeared to him after they arrived, and he said, "This is it. This is the place I was telling you about." Now, does God say, "It's all yours"? No, he did not. He said, "To your descendants I will give this land." Now, I don't know about you, but I most likely would have assumed that God was going to give me the land right when I arrived. But God didn't say that. He said, "I will bless you and make you a great nation." It would have been a letdown for me to be like, I traveled all this way, I made it, I did it, I'm done. No, that's not how it works. I will give this to your descendants. We can read in Hebrews 11, won't turn there, but we read there a summary about how Abraham obeyed. It says that he went out not knowing where he was going. We said it wasn't a short trip where upon his arrival he could just settle down and live out the rest of his life. We know that he spent the rest of his life in tents and was a foreigner in this land that God had promised to him. Later in life, it becomes clear that he more fully understood these promises. But God didn't tell him everything up front. He didn't tell him everything up front. Abraham had faith, he believed God, and he obeyed. What about us? Let's think about ourselves. Do we believe God? Do we obey him even when we don't understand? Or do we question him? Are we like Abraham? Or another example that we're familiar with, like Jonah. We know Jonah either didn't like what God had wanted him to do, or he didn't understand it. In either case, he ran away. Which are we like? Let's turn now to James chapter 2, a chapter about faith and works and how they go together. We'll read more about Abraham here. It teaches us that we show our faith through our actions. We know that Abraham was not perfect. He made mistakes, and we read about them. But he also repeatedly provided an example of obedience to God, obeying God before he knew or fully understood what God had in store for him. Here's another example. And Abraham succeeded in his faith and obedience to God. We'll read James chapter 2, verses 21 through 23. James 2, verse 21 says, "Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? Do you see that faith was working together with his works, and by works faith was made perfect?" Verse 23, "And the scripture was fulfilled which says, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God." Abraham believed God. He was confident in God. He completely trusted him to the point of being willing to sacrifice his own son. How was his faith so strong? Well, one way is from his experiences. Our experiences strengthen our faith. He obeyed, and then God confirmed by fulfilling his promises that he was, in fact, trustworthy. And another way that Abraham's faith was strong is because he knew God. He knew God. He was close to God. It says here that he was God's friend. God, the Creator, the one who became Jesus Christ, the Creator of all things, called Abraham his friend. What about us? Would God call us his friends? Or are we considered more of an acquaintance? Something to think about. We know our closest friends very well, our human close friends. We know them very well. We know what is important to them. We know what they like. We know what they don't like. We know their quirks. We know what drives them crazy. We know their strengths, their weaknesses, their hobbies, their fears. We know their birth date, or at least pretty close. We know them really, really well. We know things about them they wouldn't share with anyone else because we're really close. We're good friends. Can we say this about God? Are we close enough to him to be considered his friend? Abraham was, and we have that opportunity as well. Abraham teaches us here, lesson number 2, prompt obedience even when we don't understand. Moving on to lesson number 3. It builds on this concept. Now, unlike Abraham, The Bible says very little about this next man. Turn to Genesis chapter 5. We don't know much about him, but he still provides an important example for us to follow. What is said about him says a lot about his character and who he was. Genesis chapter 5. Now, we will, just a warning, we will be turning back and forth a little bit more than typical, just to be able to get a full picture of this man's life. First, we'll begin by reading Genesis 5, and we'll read one verse, verse 22. Genesis 5 and verse 22. After he begot Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years and had sons and daughters. And this is where we get point number 3, or lesson number 3. Walk with God. If we are to follow in the footsteps or do as those did before us, learn from them, we need to walk with God. It says here that Enoch walked with God 300 years. This is not said of anyone else up to this point in human history. We know that Abel was righteous because God respected his offering, and because in the New Testament, multiple times it says that he was righteous. But this level of righteousness was very rare among the early patriarchs. Some of them were clearly unrighteous, like Cain, like Lamech. They were murderers. They killed others. But this sinful behavior was apparently very common in the days of Enoch. We'll quickly read Genesis 6 and verse 5. It says, "Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." Later here, God recognizes that the world was full of wickedness and corruption. It was more than just Cain and Lamech who were wicked. The wickedness had become so widespread, we know the story, that God felt the need to completely eliminate all of humanity except for one family, Noah and his family. That's how wicked it had become. Let's jump back to chapter 5 and read the rest of the verses about Enoch. Genesis 5, verses 23 and 24. "So all the days of Enoch were 365 years, and Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him." For God took him. It's very likely that because of the great corruption and evil around Enoch, that God spared him. I won't turn there, but we read later in Hebrews 11 and verse 5. Hebrews 11 verse 5 helps to clarify what this means, for God took him. It says, "By faith Enoch was taken away so that he did not see death, and was not found because God had taken him. For before he was taken, he had this testimony that he pleased God." We understand this to tell us that God took or transferred Enoch to another physical location out of harm's way. Walking with God, obeying him, having a close relationship with him, would have made him very different and likely very unpopular with those of his time. It seems very plausible that, like Cain felt towards Abel, they would have felt jealousy towards him and threatened his life. And God saved him from those threats. So we learn from Enoch the importance of walking with God. But what does that really mean, to walk with God? What does that really mean? "Can two walk together unless they are agreed?" That's from Amos 3, verse 3. "Can two walk together unless they are agreed?" And the answer is no. They do not. We don't walk with someone that we are at odds with. We walk with someone we agree with, someone that we share similar perspectives. Our spouse, our children, our grandchildren, our friends. We walk with people we desire to be close to, with people we love. So how can we be like Enoch and walk with God? Well, the Bible has quite a bit to say about this. We certainly won't take time to look at it extensively. A quick word search and found well over 20 scriptures that talk about this, how to walk with God. Many of them say that walking with God means obeying him and keeping his commandments. Others use Jesus Christ's example to follow, and that's how we walk with God. Let's turn to Colossians chapter 1. But in addition to obeying God and following Jesus Christ's example, one other important way to be close to God or to walk with him is to know him. Sounds kind of vague again. What does that mean? We will look at that. It might seem simple and obvious. Well, of course, we need to know God if we're going to be close to him, if we're going to walk with him. But how well do we actually know him? How can we get to know him better? Paul begins the letter to the Colossians here by praising them and thanking them for their right response to hearing the gospel message. He says that they were full of faith and love. And then he begins in verse 9, Colossians 1, verses 9 through 10. After praising them for their dedication, he says, "For this reason we also, since the day we heard it, do not cease to pray for you, and to ask that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding, that you may walk worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing him, being fruitful in every good work, and increasing in the knowledge of God." That's a mouthful. Let's break it down a little bit. A few things to note. It says here that God's knowledge, which we know is from his word, it tells us God's will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding. God's will is made known to us by his word. And this knowledge that he gives us has a purpose. Paul says that you may walk worthy of the Lord, worthy of Jesus Christ, fully pleasing him, being fruitful in every good work, which of course includes obedience, and increasing in the knowledge of God. I'd like to really focus on that, increasing in the knowledge of God. If we want to walk with God, we must get to know him better and better each day. Being called and discovering the Bible, reading through it once, does not fulfill this need to increase in the knowledge of God. We must continually, daily do that. To accomplish this, to gain that knowledge, we must both ask for it. We must ask God to give it to us. Otherwise, we won't have it. Paul prayed this specifically for the Colossians. He prayed that God would give them more knowledge. And two, we must put in the time every day to actually read and purposefully study our Bibles. Of course, there are other resources that are important to use as well to help us better understand what it's saying. But we must commit to putting in the time. It sounds simple, but I imagine all of you, as I know, sometimes we don't quite do it. Sometimes we fail. Sometimes we fall short. But this is one way that we must walk with God. God desires us to be close to him. He desires to call us his friends. God will always do his part perfectly. We know that. He is perfect in every way. But we must do our part, like Enoch did, so that God can say of us that he walked with God, or she walked with God. Turn to one more scripture for lesson number 3. Back to Genesis chapter 6. We'll read verse 9. Enoch wasn't actually the only man or the only woman who walked with God. We read many examples in scriptures of people who clearly walked with God. Enoch he wasn't just close to God because he had to. He wanted to, and that's important as well. But I'd like to look at another man of whom it is written that he walked with God. It was the great-grandson of Enoch. And like Enoch, he also walked against the grain of society he lived in. Let's read verse 9, Genesis 6, verse 9. This is the genealogy of Noah. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations. Noah walked with God. Noah also walked with God. Unlike literally every other human being on the earth, except him and his own nuclear family, he was the only one this was said of. Everyone else was destroyed. He was blameless. He had integrity. Now, Noah never met his great-grandfather. And here's the point of why we turned here. He never met Enoch. If my calculations are correct, Enoch died 69 years before Noah was born. But I believe that Enoch's example had a positive influence on Noah. Noah would have heard stories about him and the blessings and protection God gave him. Perhaps God taught Noah himself about Enoch. In any case, Noah followed in his footsteps. He walked with God. Like Noah did, we can also learn that from Enoch, that we can stand out in the world around us, and it's okay. We can walk against the grain of society because we walk with God. And this leads us to lesson number 4. Lesson number 4 is going to be a little bit different from the first 3 lessons. We'll look at a family, actually a family in the lineage of Jesus Christ. I'll just read some of their names here quickly. In the list of the genealogy of Christ, it said, Salma begot Boaz by Rahab, Boaz begot Obed by Ruth, Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David the king. This is the family I'd like to look at for lesson number 4, the family of David and Boaz. In the first 3 lessons, we emphasized the need to learn from those who went before us, and that is very important. But we also have a responsibility to look to the future, to teach or to pass on what we have learned to those who come after us. To pass on to those who come after us. Lesson number 4 is share our God stories. Share our God stories. By looking at the similarities between the ancestors of David, which was Rahab, Boaz, Ruth, and Naomi, and David's own life and character, I think it's reasonable for us to conclude that they shared their love of God, their perspective towards God, and their stories about God in their lives. They shared that with their children and grandchildren. These things are passed down. We know that David was a man after God's own heart. He was humble. He deeply loved God. And there's certainly an element of demeanor and personality and natural inclinations, but becoming a man after God's own heart is not something you are born with. It's something you are taught. It's something you learn. So David would have learned this. He would have learned how to be a man after God's own heart. Let's turn to Joshua chapter 6. Joshua chapter 6. Salmon or Salma begot Boaz by Rahab, which means that she, Rahab, was Boaz's mother. She was from Jericho, and her vocation was as a prostitute. She lived a lifestyle of sin, something God hates, and which punishment was death. She would have heard stories, no doubt, about this God of the Israelites, who decades before defeated the greatest nation on earth, Egypt, and parted the Red Sea. She would have heard about this pillar of cloud and of fire. She would have heard about how God protected Israel from their attackers as they wandered in the desert. And now they were outside her city. What would she do? What would Rahab do? Let's read Joshua 6, verses 22 through 25. Joshua chapter 6, verse 22. But Joshua had said to the 2 men who had spied out the country, Go into the harlot's house, and from there bring out the woman and all that she has, as you swore to her. And the young men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab, her father, her mother, her brothers, and all that she had. So they brought out all her relatives and left them outside the camp of Israel. But they burned the city and all that was in it with fire. Only the silver and gold and the vessels of bronze and iron they put into the treasury and of the house of God. And Joshua spared Rahab the harlot, her father's household, and all that she had. So she dwells in Israel to this day, because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. Rahab and her whole family were spared and redeemed from a life of sin, the only ones from Jericho. She was a Gentile who left her old life behind and became an Israelite. She believed in God. She obeyed him for the rest of her life. God redeemed her, and we know from what is written in the New Testament, we know that he considered her righteous. Think about what an impact this would have had on Boaz. For one, he wouldn't exist if she had been killed in Jericho. But Rahab, no doubt, taught her son about the loving God of Israel, who spared her life, and of the incredible wonders that he performed, and how God and his people accepted her into their community. She was a Gentile, not just a Gentile, but a prostitute. I think this would have very much influenced Boaz and how he saw Ruth when she came into his life. Let's turn to Ruth chapter 2. Continue the story of this family. Ruth chapter 4. Ruth chapter 4. Earlier in the story, when Ruth is gleaning in the field, Boaz said, "It has been fully reported to me all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father and your mother and the land of your birth, and have come to a people whom you did not know before." Boaz noticed that about her. He knew how unique this was and how special she was. He was very impressed by her love and her devotion and her sacrifice. She was a Moabite woman who left her old life, the family and the gods that she grew up with, to follow Naomi all the way back to Israel, to her God, the God of Israel, and to embrace all of this as her own. Like Rahab, Ruth gave up her former life and embraced a new life in Israel. My family and I were able to see the sight and sound production of Ruth recently at a local theater. It was interesting to watch. I won't say it was their best show, but there were many good things that we really enjoyed. One of which is they really brought out the difficulty that she would have faced. For one, the Israelites would not have liked Moabites at all because of how they had mistreated them when they were wandering in the wilderness, and just besides the fact that they were Gentiles. So she would have not fit in very well, but Boaz noticed her. Now, since Naomi's husband and all of her sons had died, there was no one to pass down the inheritance. But God established a system for Israel for these kinds of situations where the closest relative was to redeem an heir for the deceased by marrying their widow and to have a child. In this case, Ruth was the widow of the son of Elimelech, and it was his property, so it would have been her deceased husband that was the heir. Let's pick up the story of how this was handled in Ruth chapter 4. Ruth 4, verses 1 through 6. Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the close relative of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Come aside, friend, sit down here." So he came aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the close relative, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, sold the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. And I thought to inform you, saying, buy it back in the presence of the inhabitants and the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not redeem it, then tell me, that I may know, for there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am next after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Then verse 5, "But then Boaz said, on the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also buy it from Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance." And the close relative said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I ruin my own inheritance. You redeem my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Now clearly Boaz wanted to marry Ruth. I think there was a connection there, because he was specifically pointing out, remember, you have to marry her and have children, and therefore it would ruin his own inheritance. But Boaz also did it because he was a righteous man. He knew what was right. He wanted to do the right thing. His relative, the one first in line, changed his mind once he realized what was involved. Let's drop down to verses 13 through 17. "So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he went into her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a close relative. And may his name be famous in Israel. And may he be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is better to you than 7 sons, has borne him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her bosom and became a nurse to him. Also the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, There is a son born to Naomi, and they called his name Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. What an incredible story of this family, from Rahab down to David. Not only would this have been a proud family story to share to generations to come, but it was recorded and famous in all of Israel. This is the family David was born into, a family full of faith and humble obedience, and who deeply loved God. Let's turn to Psalm 19. Psalm 19. We can see David's perspective perhaps better than almost any other author because of how much he wrote in the Psalms from his heart. I'd like to read Psalm 19, verses 7 through 14. Psalm 19, verses 7 through 14. David says, "The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The statutes of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. More to be desired are they than gold, yea, than much fine gold, sweeter also than honey and the honeycomb." Verse 11, "Moreover by them your servant is warned, and in keeping them there is great reward. Who can understand his errors? Cleanse me from my secret faults. Keep back your servant also from presumptuous sins. Let them have dominion over me. Then I shall be blameless, and I shall be innocent of great transgression." Verse 14, "Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer." David was a very young man when God told Samuel about his heart, how he had a right heart. David learned this love and appreciation for God in his youth. He loved God's way of life. He recognized the blessings that come from living it. He recognized the goodness and the mercy and the love of God. David was the great-grandson of Boaz and Ruth. Now, it's like Enoch and Noah, it's highly unlikely that David ever met Boaz. It could have been as much as 100 years between them. But I believe that Rahab shared her God stories, how God had worked in her life with her children and her grandchildren, who in turn shared it with theirs. David would have known these stories. He would have embraced God like they did because of that. Their stories would have helped establish his commitment to God. The Church of God today is not unlike this family. There are many multiple generation families in the church. A number of you are far more than 2 generations, 3 or 4. Many of us grew up in the church. It's all we've ever known. We've been taught about God. We've been taught from His Word our entire lives. How well do we know our parents' and our grandparents' stories, those who first came to the truth, those who were called into God's church? How well do we know their stories? They're fascinating. How God worked miraculously, how He opened their minds, all the good things He did for them. And parents and grandparents, how often do you tell your children and your grandchildren about your God stories, how He called you, how you came into the church? What amazing wonders He's done in your life, and how that bolstered your faith in Him. Let's turn to 2 Timothy 3. Paul reminds Timothy of something very important here. 2 Timothy 3, verses 14 through 15. How that we must teach as we have been taught. 2 Timothy 3, verse 14. "But you must continue in the things which you have learned and been assured of, knowing from whom you have learned them." Verse 15, "And that from childhood you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith which is in Christ Jesus." Paul is telling Timothy to teach others just as he had been taught. How important it is to pass on what we know, what we have learned, to pass on our stories. This is crucial for the foundation of our families and of the church as a whole. Lesson number 4 is share our God stories. The words of John Dos Passos in 1941 ended by saying that we must look backwards as well as forwards. And today we've looked at 4 lessons that we can learn from those who went before us. To seek to understand, prompt obedience even when we don't understand, walk with God, and last, share our God stories. If we don't learn from those who went before us, then we will be like the Israelites were during the time of the judges. They turned quickly from the way in which their fathers walked in obeying the commandments of the Lord. They did not do so. They did not learn from their fathers. They did not do as their fathers did. They did what was right in their own eyes, and they didn't value those life lessons they could have learned. Let's close by turning to Ecclesiastes chapter 1. The last verse we'll look at, or last passage we will look at, Ecclesiastes chapter 1, and we'll read verses 9 through 11. Ecclesiastes 1, verses 9 through 11. That which has been said is what will be. That which is done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which it may be said, see, this is new? It has already been in ancient times before us. Verse 11, there is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of things that are to come by those who will come after. Applied to our topic today of learning from those who went before us, these verses remind us, first, that the basic truths and the laws of life, the laws which God established, they do not change. And second, it points out that people tend to forget. People tend to forget that. We don't remember the lessons from those who went before us. Let's reread verse 11. It says, there is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of things that are to come by those who will come after. We could say those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. We all tend to have really good memories of our own experiences, don't we? Those painful experiences that teach us, those life lessons, are seared into our memory. We can't forget them even if we wanted to. But we tend to have a poor memory of what other people experience. You know, it's hard to remember those things. We didn't experience it ourselves, and so we can sometimes make the same mistakes they did. History repeats itself. People like new things, exciting ideas. The world does change. It absolutely does. That's true. Society changes. The world that we grew up in is different from the world our parents grew up in, and it's different from the world our children will grow up in. There are new benefits and new challenges. There are similarities, certainly, but things change. However, the way that we live, those basic principles of life, they do not change. God has preserved them for us in this holy word, his holy scriptures. Brethren, let's remember the importance of learning from those who went before us, and also be diligent to share it with those who come after us.